although there were dozens and dozens of children, all bringing with them tools and ladders and paintbrushes and lunchboxes. They had all come to these grounds to play a wide variety of what they were calling games. And these games were organized by a woman named Natalie Douglas. And here's her description of some of the many, many games that she had arranged for these people to play. In her words, the Empty the Sanctuary game. Game consists of removing inappropriate or unwanted structures from the walls, floors, and stairs. Game will require 8 to 10 players. Game goes best if players have hostilities requiring release. The Build a Bathroom game. Sanctuary has only one facility. Winners will be those who, because of the second unit, won't have to stand in line come next fall. 2 to 4 players. The Paint the Windows game. I envision about 15 extension ladders on which 15 gleeful workers joyously sing along as they scrape, paint, and beautify our grounds. And last example, game is called grass mowing. Persons walk back and forth across lawn, behind mowers, lowering general level of grass. Game started 2 weeks ago, and experienced players are saying this causes the skin to sweat blood and the eyes to cry real tears. Masochists only. So every weekend, for week after week during the summer of 1981, these games found enthusiastic players among the founding families of UUI. 2 years earlier, in 1979, 93 adults had decided to form a new Unitarian Universalist church they were calling the Unitarian Universalist Church of Indianapolis. And after bouncing around in a variety of different spaces for 2 years, mostly Methodist churches, they finally had the opportunity in 1981 to buy their own building and grounds, which is the space that we occupy today. This space, these buildings, did not come ready to use, to put it mildly, but the families were committed to their vision of a new church. So they cheerfully and tirelessly went to work, playing the Fix the Roof game and the Rewire the Outlets game and the Clean the Gutters game and all the other games, and some 2,100 volunteer hours later, the buildings and grounds we now enjoy as our campus were ready to become home for the new church. 2,100 hours. So impressive was the spectacle of their collective effort that it earned them a lengthy article in the Indy Star at the time, headlined "Work Dedication by All Members." A copy of the article is available in a scrapbook in the library over here in the cottage, and you can see in the article a picture of UUI member Bill Marsh clinging rather precariously to a cupola on the roof while he's painting it. I don't see a safety harness in the picture, but I assume it's just obscured from view. So work and dedication. It takes a great deal of work and dedication to bring a new church into being. It takes a great deal of work and dedication to sustain a church. This is our 40th anniversary of UUI, our 40th anniversary year. And as we approach our celebration party in October, this is a great time to be reflecting on UUI's past, what we want for UUI's future, whether we're new members thinking about becoming a member, or whether we've been here for 5, 10, 20 years, or even 40 years like some of our founding members. The church is the collective, collaborative creation of all of its members. So UUI will be a thriving future just as we give it a thriving future. And as this is a time for looking to the future, I thought we would begin by honoring our past. Because once upon a time, the church that we enjoy today was just the imagined future of a small group of families, and we are the beneficiaries of their hard work and their dedication to our imagined future. So, what is it those 93 adults and 100 plus kids were working towards? What were they dedicated to? In our library over in the cottage, you can find collected biographies of past UUI members in 2 books called Souls and Spirits, Volume 1 and 2. If you read the biographies of these UUI members, you will meet a remarkable group of people who were devoted to free thinking, to science, to curiosity and to questions, to women's equality, to tolerance and freedom, to the arts and education, and to social progress. Their energy and enthusiasm for life is and was remarkable and impressive. A typical retiree that you're reading might note in her bio that at age 80, she's finally slowed down. She mostly spends her time at the zoo, the symphony, the art museum, volunteering for Planned Parenthood, and a few other associations. I always say there's no one busier than a retired Unitarian. And they lived life against the grain, often bucking the conventions or the narrow moors of small-town Indiana, where they were largely from, or medium-town Indianapolis. They were making their own way. And all of them found in Unitarian Universalism the best expression of their humane values and their independent spirit. I should mention it's been 20 years since the last volume of Souls and Spirits. Right now, many, many people at UUI are hard at work bringing out the next volume of Souls and Spirits, Volume 3, which will bring together the life stories of all of our current UUI members, age 65 and older. Look for that later this year. It's going to be a real gift to the congregation. It's a remarkable undertaking, so please thank all of the people who were involved. Now, if you look at the founding documents of our church, you can find surveys and conversations about what was wanted for this new church and what was being created. The founders, first and foremost, wanted a church where children were an integrated part of the life of the church and welcomed into its worship and all of its activities. This being a family-friendly community was deeply important to them. They wanted a church characterized by warm relationships with a welcoming atmosphere. They wanted a church that was committed to social justice and making an impact on the community around them. And they wanted a democratic church where everyone had an equal say and everyone was a part of the creation of our shared life, where people could jump in and dive in and just share their gifts. The Church of the Warm Heart, Open Mind, and Social Conscience was printed on the first bulletin of UUI. Today, that motto appears on your bulletin as the Warm Heart, Open Mind, and Helping Hands. A year's list of sermon topics from the first year of UUI gives a fascinating and endearing picture of the eclectic interests of the church. We find pastoral sermons dealing with general life concerns like you would expect, like looking at life from a spiritual perspective, being young, being old, creative dreaming, let it go, let it go. This was before that one movie. But we also find a sermon called The Gathering Storm Facing American Education, a sermon called Zionism and Anti-Semitism, a Religious or a Political Issue. Just in time for the Christmas season, we have a sermon called Jesus and the Sun God, a Reappraisal of Christmas. And then there is the awesomely titled sermon, Judicial Settlement of Disputes under the United Nations Charter, Some Observations on the Effectiveness of the World Court. So this is a congregation in the spirit of Unitarian Universalism has always wanted its religion to speak to real-world concerns and urgent issues. Our values are intended not just to edify our own lives, but to make a real difference in the world. So if we look back at 1979, the year of UUI's founding, we can see the emergence of issues then that have assumed great prominence in our national life today. We can see how UUI's values called its members to respond then, and how it calls us to respond now, and how we are responding now. And so today, as we round out this sermon, I wanted to look at just 3 of those issues that were emerging in 1979 and see how UUI has been and still is making a difference. So for example, in 1979, the Vietnamese refugee crisis, which began immediately after the end of the war in 1975, had really reached its peak. 78, 79, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people were fleeing the country in boats looking for safer shores. There was an international coordinated effort to try to deal with this issue. And so one of the first acts of UUI as a new church was a unanimous vote to sponsor a refugee family from Vietnam. 20 and a 24-year-old brother and sister who'd made their way from Da Nang by open boat to a refugee camp in Hong Kong, and from there to Indianapolis through Catholic Charities. So members of UUI greeted them at the airport, found them an apartment, and arranged for health care and social services. Members of UUI donated furniture, bedding, cooking utensils, even a TV to get them up in their new place. But before that happened, they started out there in the cottage building. And that's where we sheltered them and provided for them, and that's where they stayed for a very long time until they got on their own feet and could have their own space. They began intensive English training and found jobs. The sister eventually married a fellow in Ohio. The brother, as I said, lived in the cottage building for a time, finished a technical degree, and moved on to begin his career. So welcoming refugees is part of our living tradition. More broadly, the principles of Unitarian Universalism challenge us to make justice, equity, and compassion the foundation with which we respond to one another in times of need. So today we face a new global migration of refugees, this one on our borders and in our cities, and we face the consequences of decades of failed, inhumane, and sometimes deadly immigration policies, all in the context of a mass movement of people the likes of which the world has never seen. UUI works with Faith in Indiana to advocate for a response to these challenges which prioritizes the health and well-being of all people and seeks to keep families together. You can learn more about that work at the Find Your Spot or by talking to me, but this is one way in which we live out these values. So here's another event from 1979 that touched on issues that would later rise to great prominence in our national life. 1979 was the year of the trial of one Dan White. Dan White was the man who murdered San Francisco politicians Harvey Milk and George Moscone, who were the first openly gay elected public servants in the country. And Dan White's lawyer argued that Mr. White was under the influence of sugar intoxication when he committed the crime, the so-called Twinkie defense, and it was successful. So a sympathetic jury found him guilty of manslaughter, but not murder, and he got a much lighter sentence. So LGBT people rioted in response, and later that year, the National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights drew between 75 and 125,000 LGBT people, straight allies, to Washington, D.C. to protest for civil equality. So this was up in the air in 1979, just the beginnings of the LGBTQ rights movement. Within Unitarian Universalism, 1979 marks the year that Reverend Douglas Morgan Strong was called to serve All Souls Church, Augusta, Maine, becoming the first out gay minister to be called to serve a UU congregation, 1979. The UUA had been working to advance LGBT concerns arguably since 1971, when the About Your Sexuality curriculum was published, which was much more open and affirming to the full spectrum of sexuality, right? We were teaching kids about these things in 1971. And later in the 70s, it established an Office of Gay Concerns, using the language of its day. So UUI's support for the emerging movement for LGBTQ rights has been many and varied, and it goes deep in this congregation's DNA. Its founding members expressed in their surveys when they talked about what kind of church they wanted. They said they wanted to build a church, as they put it, a progressive atmosphere, a church where a gay caucus could exist. Remember, this is 1979. Since then, we've taught several generations of children and youth the progressive sexuality that eventually became the Our Whole Lives curriculum, which is 100% affirming of GLBTQ sexuality. We've been marching as a congregation every year in the Indy Pride Parade since the early 2000s. We've supported the Indiana Youth Group with free meals and the hosting of gay proms. And members of UUI fought long and hard for marriage equality in Indiana. During the very brief window in the summer of 2014, when LGBT marriage became legal in Indiana, UUI actually arranged for LGBT marriages to be performed here in this sanctuary. Then it became illegal again, and then finally legal for good in 2015. And since 2003, we've been a certified welcoming congregation, which means that the congregation voted to go through a UUA certification program to make explicit our institutional commitment to welcome all people to UUI, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender expression. Now today, we see continued and even escalating hostility in our civic life to the full participation of LGBTQ people. Right? Economic discrimination is still very real. It is oftentimes fully illegal to discriminate economically against LGBT people. Our trans siblings face high levels of violence and social persecution. And we've learned from recent surveys and conversations that even our UU churches are not always creating an environment that is as welcoming as we aspire to be, especially to transgender people. And so the Unitarian Universalist Association has rolled out a new program called the 5 Practices of Welcoming that replaces the kind of one and done approach to being a welcoming congregation with an ongoing process of education and engagement 5 practices that you do every year so that you are taking continuous steps to live out our welcoming commitment in a real and meaningful way. So that's something that we will be engaged in this year. It's new. Look for more information as the church year progresses, and if you want to get involved, please email me at ministry@uui.org. And finally, third topic. Here's an interesting factoid from 1979. This is according to the nasa.gov website, and it has to do with our understanding of the environment. So throughout the 1970s, environmental scientists were becoming increasingly aware that human industrial activity had the potential to significantly impact the climate. They understood that we were doing something, but the tricky thing was different effects ran in different directions. We were releasing a lot of industrial particulates into the atmosphere. Those tend to reflect the sun's light back out into space, away from the atmosphere. That has a cooling effect. We were also releasing a lot of carbon. That traps the sunlight. It has a warming effect. So there was a period in the 70s where scientists did not know which effect was going to predominate. So they called this inadvertent climate modification to refer to this yet unknown phenomenon. But by the end of the decade, we understood much better what the future held in store for us. So in 1979, the Academy of Science published a decisive study of carbon dioxide's impact on climate. And this study used for the very first time in the literature the phrase global warming, 1979. So when UUI was founded in 1979, this language would not have been on everyone's lips. But the values that would call us to respond to the problem were there, again, embedded deep in this congregation's DNA. Now, Unitarians had been integral to the founding of the modern environmental movement, beginning with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, and ecological values ran deep for us. In May of 1981, 2 days after the papers for this property were signed, UUI celebrated Earth Day by planting a tree on these grounds. Everyone, including the children, took a turn with the shovel, and recognizing Earth Day has been an annual UUI tradition ever since. We've consistently lived into these values in significant ways on the local level. For example, members of UUI, like Glenn Pratt, fought long and hard to bring clean and safe drinking water to Indianapolis's marginalized neighborhoods, partnering with the local NAACP and others. More recently, members of UUI were involved in a coordinated effort to save the oldest patch of forest in Indianapolis from being cut down over at Crown Hills, and they were successful. But today, in the face of the threat of global warming, we understand, like never before, that environmental issues represent both a local and a global challenge, and so we are being called to respond in new ways. So that brings me to the Green Sanctuary Program. When the UUA rolled out its Green Sanctuary Program in the 2000s, some members of UUI went to the board and said, we want our church to participate in this environmental program, this new thing. And the board said, let's put it to a congregational vote to honor our democratic process, which is very important, and we want buy-in from the entire community, and the vote overwhelmingly passed. So recognizing that a commitment to sustainability would and should impact the whole life of the church, the board brought in stakeholders from all of the major committees, looking at how could we make a sustainable core commitment to a new common practice for the life of UUI. UUI then partnered with the Spirit and Place Festival to give presentations to over 50 churches about how to be more sustainable. We did this 3 years in a row. We helped found Indy Green Congregations, which goes out into the community and teaches churches all over Indiana how to be sustainable. We helped found Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light, which is fighting the good fight for progressive policy here in Indiana. We partnered with 6 other congregations to get a grant to bring solar panels to our cottage roof in 2013. And of course, in 2017, we raised the funds to install our ground array, which makes us almost 100% solar powered. And I can tell you that this very significant commitment to solar energy has captured people's attention. So people seek us out, other churches, and say, how did you do that? How can we do that? Help us make this a reality. We're talking to other churches about that even as we speak. Today, our sustainability team works to promote a broad array of sustainability practices, from energy efficiency to recycling, They will have a table at the Find Your Spot Festival. I'm sure they'd love to hear about your ideas for how we can all lead more sustainable and ethical lives for the protection of our shared planet. So the 93 people who founded UUI said they wanted a church with active civic engagement. They wanted a church that made a difference in the community around it. That was the living tradition that they passed on to us, right? Our experiences with Faith in Indiana, with LGBTQ welcoming, with the Green Sanctuary program, are examples of how we have lived out that tradition and how it really does matter. UUI is a place where an idea can come to life and ultimately impact the life and the institutions of our neighborhood, of our city, of our state, and our world. And maybe you have your own ideas that this church is just waiting to engage with. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing," she said, "that ever has." UUI is a place where thoughtful, committed citizens support and encourage one another to bring our values into the world, and it matters, because the world needs our values now more than it ever has. So my friends, whether this is your new church home or your church home of long and happy memory, let us honor the hard work and dedication that brought this church into being and sustained the vision of a democratic, family-friendly, socially active church for 40 years. That is our living tradition, a gift freely given to us, and it is up to us to carry it forward for another 40 years, adding to it our energy, our vitality, and our own dreams. I ask you to think about what are the values that you bring to UUI, and how can they be brought to life here? How will you shape the living tradition of UUI for the next generation? The opening words from the very first service held here in this building read, "We come here today with great joy to our new church home, and together we take up the glorious adventure of making it a place of welcome for every good thing that inspires the lives of people." So I invite you in that spirit to take up the glorious adventure that is the future of UUI in the spirit of fellowship and friendship. Let's roll up our sleeves and do the work together. Blessed be, and amen.